Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. As always, Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors, co-host of the show here. Kevin, glad to see you.
Great to see you too, Tim.
And you just got back from a nice little trip on the East Coast back in DC, and you were really kind of visiting back there, getting the temperature, what's going on in DC right now. Can you tell us, some of the major things that you noticed while you were back there, and also the latest on the federal budget?
Yeah. So we were back there, good timing, just sort of on the eve of, and then ultimately stayed for the introduction of the president's budget plan that he put out. So all of that, but we also got to have a number of meetings over at the White House. We actually got some time with Secretary Cardona, people over at the U.S. Department of Ed, and it was great. I mean, they were just incredibly accessible. And then, of course, a bunch of some of the new leadership in the House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate. They're going to be working on education issues. So it was, good meetings overall, but, interesting dynamics relative to the budget. And we were talking to some Republican leadership on the House side, and they're working feverishly on sort of appropriations bills, spending bills, kind of what they're going to want to do relative to overall spending issues. And of course, I think we all know that they've been pretty public about saying that they'd actually like to see a lot of cuts on the domestic side of the budget, but they're putting a plan together that would actually go that direction. And meanwhile, then the president puts his budget out that has, significant new spending, but particularly in education, where, he's spending, $20.5 billion in Title I, which represents, my notes are just showing me here, a $2.2 billion increase just in Title I. He's got probably one of the biggest increases proposed for special ed that I've ever seen in a single year, $2.7 billion. There's several other components to the president's budget that add up to billions of dollars of new investment in education that he would propose that essentially isn't really going to go anywhere. But what it really does is it formulates kind of what is going to be his platform in his reelection, is knowing that you've got to have the House and the Senate together, even when there's differences, two-house agreement. When you're trying to spend a lot of money and you got a House that's really preoccupied with cutting money, those things don't mix very well. And even the notion of compromise where maybe you would spend less, I just don't think you're going to get out of that out of a House leadership that's bent on making sure that we're cutting the budget to meet sort of their targets. In fact, if you protect, the health and welfare side of the budget relative to Medicaid and Medicare, which some Republicans have said that's important to them, and you take that off of the domestic spending side, they'd have to have cuts in excess of like 33% to all remaining domestic programs, including education. That's just not going to happen. And so the dynamic is really interesting back there because, again, both sides will have their plans. Most of those plans will really not go anywhere. Who knows what they'll do on defense side spending, but I don't know that there's going to be much traction on anything. And the one thing that we do have when we can't get to an agreement on a federal budget plan back in Washington, D.C., is you essentially get level funding. You get funding where at the level you got in the prior year. I wish we had that in California, that when you can't get agreement in some of our toughest years and people wanted to cut the budget, you ultimately have to have a budget plan that the worst case scenario is you get what you got in the prior year. Would be nice to know that would always be the safety net. But that's what we have in Washington, D.C. And what we can hope for is hope against cuts. It'd be great to get augmentation and increases, but it's not likely to happen. So when you see these big, statements made by we're going to produce a plan here that is a $2.7 billion increase for special ed, don't count on it because the politics are just not right for it. It's great for us to give voice to these issues. And we're going to be working with, there's a few districts that are taking the lead, including Orchid Unified School District, Capistrano Unified, and San Ramon Valley are really sort of picking up the mantle and being aggressive about a unified approach toward advocating on special ed, not just in California, but all across the country. And you may be discouraged by sort of the budget reality in DC that we're not going to see that kind of thing happen this year, but we have to give voice to the issues and campaign on those issues. So anyways, we went back there, kind of took the temperature back in Washington, D.C., and it's really ripe for policymakers to hear the messages that I know that they're going to be brought by CSBA and AXA in what's being billed as the Coast to Coast lobbying trip. We're going to be back there for that, helping out. But we know that they're going to be school district superintendents and school board members in a very, very large, probably a record number, together from California, giving voice to a variety of critical issues. So it's going to be that's going to be at the end of April. So April 24th through the 27th.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your support and support of these education leaders, including our friend Holly Eads over at Orcut, doing great things in special education. I guess one observation after doing this broadcast with you so many times is, Biden's eagerness to improve and increase the funding for special ed. It's been brought up and, I guess put out there on several occasions, and it seems to have not, taken root. As you mentioned, again, there's risk of that this time.
Right.
Can I ask you why does that seem so hard of a thing for him to get done? Is that too tricky of a thing to try to talk about?
I've always thought it's because the president had a multi-pronged list of goals when he came in, and he got some of them. The big infrastructure package, he got that. They were finishing up doing stuff on COVID relief. They got that last, ESSER 3 through. They did achieve some things, but he had so many things that even if there was sentiment to support it, it just wasn't enough to get all of the stuff he wanted over the finish line. And his budget proposals were part of what didn't happen. And so he comes into this budget season, puts this stuff on the table, and now you got a different dynamic where, again, the House leadership has changed. The partisan, differences are obviously clear. And you've got one House that is focused with Republicans on cutting budgets, and you got the other House that would like to actually grow and expand the budget. And the president's where he's always been. This budget proposal, in a lot of ways, is similar to what the president has initiated in terms of focus areas for big new investment. He's got those on the table again. What I do think you're pointing out, Tim, is something that should be a no-brainer in special ed, that if there was a way to peel it out and say, on this issue, what do you think? I think you could actually get bipartisan support, because there's a bunch of Republicans who understand the arguments about fully funding special ed. And many Republican presidents, in fact, I can't think of one that did not at least articulate support for full funding for special ed, but the politics of their own tenure in office didn't give them the latitude to make it happen. I will tell you that George W. Bush had one of the biggest single-year augmentations of special ed amongst the different occupants of the White House. Clinton had his, and again, modest in the scope of never getting really close to the 40% promise on special ed, but we know Republicans are there. So the effort that Holly and Orchid and John in San Ramon Valley and Kirsten Vitale, and now sort of taken over by Clark Hampton, the interim superintendent at Capistrano, what they've been focused on is, let's rally the troops in California on this issue, but let's go to the school districts that correspond to the members of the Education and Workforce Committee in the House that are in other states, and actually share together and strategize together on how we get all members, Republicans and Democrats, to hear the issue and say, can you sign on to this effort to get fully funded for special ed? And let's stop making it a partisan issue and make it instead a bipartisan issue, and see if we can make some traction there. But it's going to be a multi-year effort to get there, but I think we're going to actually be able to make some progress over time.
All right. Thanks so much for that explanation, Kevin. And thank you for the work that you're doing with those education leaders that are partnering with their legislators and advocating for something that's absolutely needed, like special ed funding and increase there. So really appreciate your efforts. Speaking of gridlock in DC, we've been following a story on the FCC nominee, Gigi Sohn, If you've been following this, is about 18 months she's been nominated. There was tremendous pressure against her, taking that seat. And at this point, she's withdrawn as the nominee, which leaves that fifth spot vacant. It's been vacant basically for the 2 years that Biden's been in office. And we'll have a little link to an article in The Verge that explains how, with the timing and the process involved in getting someone new and in place, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to have an impact to get someone in perhaps before Biden's out of this term, but to have an impact that we would see while Biden's in office. So it is a bit frustrating. There was going to certainly be some efforts towards net neutrality. And again, you'll read more about the article in there. And we all know how, crucial the FCC is in impacting things like our communication, internet, and things like E-rate, which we also talk about very frequently on this show. So it's very important. It's frustrating, I think, for folks to see something like that, but it is a fact, and we wanted to share that with you because we've been doing a lot of coverage there. So, Kevin, I want to jump in. There's a lot of state revenue news. Everyone's been on edge about that. As we know, things are starting to cool in the economy. Can you give us the latest there, please?
Yeah. So, and we just got a report just this week, again, more updated numbers. And we were concerned about the fact that we already knew that the revenue numbers were slipping really even below what the governor had forecast on January 10th. Normally, we always talk about how far are revenues off or on target with what the legislature and the governor did when they adopted the budget last summer. Well, what we're paying attention to now is how on target or off target are these numbers compared to the governor's budget proposal that he just made in January. And we're off those numbers. Starting with the legislative analyst, and I think many people have probably heard me talk about the fact that the legislative analyst, which usually are pretty conservative when they give their sort of overview about budget scenarios, went out on the limb and said, just so you know, we think there's an 80% chance the governor's being too hopeful with regard to revenues. And of course, the reason why the LAO said that with great certainty is they could see pretty easily with a lot of the different variables that go into forecasting the economy that it was almost for certain that we were going to have a bigger revenue drop than what the governor was anticipating. And so very quickly, this is a matter of just a number of weeks ago, we saw that the numbers were as much as $3.3 billion off of the governor's own projections for revenue. And then today we took another look and it's almost $4.7 billion off of the governor's January budget proposals. It's a very significant drop. It's going to mean, the legislature is going to have a lot of, maneuvering to do relative to this budget. One of the things that Abe Hajela, who's one of our partners in the firm, who looks at a lot of these numbers, has recently put out a commentary to, our clients about this issue and sort of observed that when you're dealing with $250 billion budget, and then there are other variables that are complicating our ability to forecast what's going on. It's not time to completely panic yet because we do have a lot of safety nets. People know that the state has a very large reserve of its own. We know that we have an $8.5 billion K-12 reserve. We know that they have shifted the deadline for filing taxes in more than 40 California counties. It's actually closer to 45, almost 50 of the 58 counties now are not going to have to file taxes till October. I mean, we had during the pandemic some relief on when you'd file taxes that pushed it into the summer. The notion of not knowing until October what's really going on with revenue is a little scary thought in terms of really putting together a budget this year that has any accuracy relative to what's going to happen to revenue. So they're just going to have to try to be as conservative as they can. One of the things that I get concerned about is, there are people around the Capitol who will say, well, the legislature and the governor may likely be more optimistic with regard to a budget and pass a budget that tends to be optimistic. I actually worry about the reverse, which is that they actually guess that the circumstances are going to be a lot worse than they may turn out to be. That actually happened, if you remember, during COVID, where the governor put out a May revision that anticipated that the bottom was going to drop out of revenues and called for a 10% cut across the board for schools all over the state. And sort of this panic ran through the education community for reductions that were never required to actually take place. that revenue did not end up dropping. And in fact, we ended up having pretty big increases in revenue. Not that that's going to replicate itself, but just to say there's a lot of fuzziness out there about what the budget reality is. It's not a good thing that the revenues sliding off of even the January estimates by as much as they are. But again, we're waiting to see what's going on with this really interesting economy, made even more volatile and interesting, if you will, by what's been going on with regard to the banks and what happened with the Silicon Valley Bank. So we're just going to have to keep our close eye on this, monitoring every single month, really almost by week to see what's happening as we do the run up to the May revision. I will say this, some folks have said maybe the May revision won't be out by May 15th. I expect it will absolutely be out by May 15th. It'll just be a lot harder for budget writers to estimate what's in it. So we'll see which track they take, whether they tend to be more optimistic or more pessimistic, but it's going to lack the certainty that May revisions have typically had over the past. So, and again, fingers crossed that we're going to be able to make it through this. I'm confident that the reserve that we have for K-12 education is something that is going to be a really important safety net for us that we're going to end up having to utilize.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, the variance between May revise and July budget is usually very, very minimal.
Correct.
But, based on what you're saying about these tax revenues and the uncertainty in the financial sector, that it could change quite a bit this year. And I know that's unsettling for everyone who's getting ready for next year's budgets, right? And starting July 1, you've got to be operating in a new budget. So we feel for you out there, and please take some time to help spread the word about this broadcast, because we will be covering this more as this heats up. And I will also say, Kevin, it's probably a good time to bring up the May revise workshops that you're going to do. Your team, everyone, if you don't know, the Capital Advisors team does a whirlwind tour around many of the counties in the state of California. These are free events, and you get to hear the Capital Advisors team, always hosted by the county superintendent, local county soup. And you're going to find, yourself superintendents, board members, chief business officers in there, trying to get the latest on what's going on with the budgets. So I believe those are on the website. Kevin, is that correct? That people will register now? They'll
actually be up next week. And then again, it's real simple. It's at www.capitaladvisors.org, and capital is with an OL, remind you that, and it is .org, not .com. So yeah, capitaladvisors.org next week. Everyone has gotten used to the fact these do not cost anything to attend. We put those out there. Really, we have the county superintendents to thank who helped sponsor these by having us as their advocates in those respective counties. And so that'll be brought to you. And it'll be the second iteration of budget workshops we do in any given year. We do, of course, the January budget workshop. We do the May revision budget workshops, which happen honestly mostly in late May, early June. And then we do the final Budget Act workshop so that everyone knows exactly what actually happened. And those will happen probably in that first week of July. So get ready for registration to open next week for the May revision budget workshops.
Thanks for announcing that, Kevin. Thanks for putting those on. And we'll definitely have a link to the Capital Advisors website where you'll be able to register for those when the registration's up. But that'll be later in May. And appreciate you doing that again. I want to jump into something we've been talking quite a bit about, and a major frustration for folks that we cover often, and that is around cybersecurity. And particularly, there was a lot of coverage, at CSBA and the LAUSD issues, as well as many other districts in the state and around the country. CASBO, I was fortunate enough to be able to write a few articles for the CASBO newsletter. You may have read some of those, but just trying to help folks kind of understand at a business level how this can impact, how cybersecurity can impact the business of schools. And one of the major things that we've been dealing with is that there is no real funding source specifically for this issue in K-12, and it is a major issue that's keeping people up at night. So there's been a lot of advocacy efforts out there, AASA and ASCD, and COSIN, which is the national version of SITE, our technology departments. There's been a lot of folks out there advocating for funding for cybersecurity for schools, particularly around leveraging E-rate funds, which currently help us get on the internet, and do some for cybersecurity to allow E-rate to help us more with cybersecurity. I wanted to give that little backstory because NSBA, National Scoreboard Association, chimed in with a letter to DC with asking for support for this as well. I want to just add that NSBA, we appreciate their advocacy. Their letter very much focused on firewalls, which interestingly enough, there are limited amounts of dollars that are covered for firewalls right now in E-rate. So they're asking for more advanced firewalls, which will certainly help. I just thought it was interesting simply because it is not the only tool needed in today's world to deal with cybersecurity. There's a lot of pieces of software and services that school districts need to support this. So definitely glad to see another major national organization get on board and ask for support. And either way, this is something I hope you'll take some time to educate yourself on. And in those moments, the ones that Kevin brought up, where you're maybe talking to a legislator and you're asking for help, this is an area where your district needs help. Your tech team needs support in this area, and we need your help in squeaking the wheel to make this happen. So, please take some time. We'll put a little article in there as well. You get to read about that NSBA ask, and please take some time to do some advocacy around this because it is a powerful topic that people need some help on.
Yeah,
anything to add there, Kevin?
Yeah, I did want to mention, I'm really glad you brought it up, is that part of the advocacy we did in Washington, D.C. last week, and sort of articulated by a group of superintendents from San Diego County, led by the county superintendent, Dr. Paul Gothold, touched on the cybersecurity issue. And he actually got a chance to talk to, it was an event that had like one staff person in the entire room and about 15 members of Congress, including Nancy Pelosi and a lot of leadership folks. And he got a chance to articulate the importance of exactly kind of what you've been talking about, Tim, which is that it does make sense for us to try to use and leverage the E-rate funding, and that there's these different there's two categories of expenditures currently allowable for E-rate, and that the idea of establishing a third category that let you use it for cybersecurity makes a lot of sense. Our chances of creating an entirely new bureaucracy under a new agency is almost nil in this political environment. But the notion of unlocking some of those funds so we can use that for cybersecurity, and then, refueling that fund is an easier argument than creating a whole new bureaucracy. And he did a great job of articulating that, along with Lamont Jackson, the superintendent of San Diego Unified, and Marianne Kim Phelps from Poway Unified. And then we also had Jim Clevenger from Bonsall. The three of them just did a great job about talking about this issue. The other thing I will note is that CSBA has its legislative action conference coming up, and they've identified not a huge list of key issues. Cybersecurity is one of them, and they're asking for greater flexibility, and that's CSBA at the state level, flexibility with regard to state resources so that districts can access those monies to use for cybersecurity as well. They're going to have to pay for it one way or another. Getting flexibility from the state's really important in the short run until we can get the feds and others to step up with some really meaningful resources to take care of this liability you're going to have in the long run.
Well, that's great to hear. Thanks for bringing that up. And we have tremendous respect for Dr. Gothold and what he's done. I want to just say, too, this has come up before. There are some agencies, or I think some of the associations were saying, hey, it's not really an E-rate thing. We should be going to these, different areas. But to your point, there are multiple areas that support schools in this. And when you get two different parts of government and you want to get them on the same page to get something done, that just adds so many layers of complexity, right? So we've got the Department of Homeland Security, who's got the cybersecurity infrastructure folks that are worried about cybersecurity across the board for government agencies. And we've got Department of Education. And, getting them on the same page to get something done is, would be wonderful. But, the odds of that happening anytime soon are tough, as you mentioned. And that's why this E-rate thing is kind of that sweet spot, because it's a vehicle that's already in place. It just needs some fine tuning to get that funding. So anyway, great example of education leaders that are pulling together around a topic, and wonderful to hear that CSBA is jumping on board and adding that to their list of items to advocate for as well. So thanks for sharing that, Kevin. With that, I know, just getting back into California, Some big news out right now about charter school renewals that impacts a lot of districts. Can you let us know what's going on there, please?
Yeah, in fact, we were looking to see what kind of, additional controversy there would be over charter schools potentially brewing this year. And surprisingly, there's very little introduced in the legislature in charter schools at all. But then amendments that were put in just this week by Senator Alvarado Gil, who herself was involved with very active in charter schools, but a Democrat in the legislature, and definitely trying to actually figure out a way to make things a little extend the piece, if you will, of what's existed over the last couple of years. Because again, there are a lot of charter schools that are going to be coming up for renewal, and there has been sort of an extension that's been in law to kind of give everybody a reprieve, given the fact that we don't really have the kind of data over the past couple of years to tell us what's really going on with the progress of these students. And we're not going to really have that data till even later. So the idea of them being immediately up for renewal right now is controversial. People that don't particularly care for charters would not like to give them any more room for extensions than exist right now. And then charter school advocates are pushing for the extension for obvious reasons. So she's going to carry legislation that was announced today, carry legislation that in fact will extend for another 2 years the renewal expiration, if you will, of charters, pushing that out a little bit further to give us the time to actually be making judgments about renewals predicated on real data. And that's the objective of her legislation. And what's happened in the last election cycle is the charter school community was really more active than and successful in certain ways in this last election. And as a result of that, there's a more sort of mixture of legislators with different sentiments about charter schools. It has been a legislature, in my opinion, that has been decidedly sort of not overly friendly to charter schools. And I think you've softened that a little bit with the emergence of some of the new leadership that's going to be coming in to the assembly, at least. But even on a bipartisan basis, you're going to just see a more sentiment, good timing for the charter school community to probably be successful with this extension, I think, just handicapping it from right now. But, the bill's got a long ways to go, so we'll see what happens. But probably the most significant charter school bill that we're going to see amongst maybe just one or two bills that will deal with charters, it'll be the most significant bill that's debated in the legislature this year.
Yeah, always a hot topic, and thank you for filling us in on that, and we'll keep you folks posted as that evolves as well. And with that, I want to just add one final thing. The last time we spoke, we were putting on a webinar for cybersecurity. Randy Bassett, the former recently retired Super Fontana, very technology-oriented superintendent, joined us to have a conversation. A cybersecurity expert, Brian Rohde, was on. And we were talking about, what non-technical school districts leaders need to know about cybersecurity right now to improve your school district without having all the funds that we talked about. Just what are some simple things that any leader needs to know and do to be able to help. That we'll put a link to the recording in the message that goes out and underneath the video here. So please take a chance to view it yourself or listen to it when you're driving along. And one more time, I'm just going to say thank you, everyone who's taken the time to watch this broadcast, all the folks that have sent us nice messages about appreciating it. We do appreciate you. And remember, we don't have an advertising budget or a campaign other than just asking you to please share this with your friends out over social media, or give us a like, and that'll kind of help us even within YouTube. And then you can always subscribe to the channel and you'll get notified every time we add a new video. So with that, Kevin, I want to say thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you, everybody, for checking in, and please stay safe out there.
Great. Thank you. So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.